Hi, my name is Ornella Musingazi and I'm from Kampala, Uganda, and I'm a freshman at CU studying political science and leadership studies. The panel you're about to watch is called Racial Solidarity is a Verb, which tackles working together towards collective liberation and racial justice. I hope you enjoy.
Hello, good morning, good afternoon, good evening to everybody. um, so, to start off, I want to welcome and thank you, everybody, for joining today. Us at the CU Boulder Conference on World Affairs virtual panel. Racial solidarity is a verb. All the CWA panels are being recorded on YouTube and will be available to watch immediately after the event on the CWA YouTube channel. You may submit your questions at any time during the session on the YouTube chat. We invite you to also share if you're a CU student and where you're located so that way we can all kind of see how we're all still connected. So just as a quick introduction, my name is Adrian Salazar, and I'll be your moderator today. I'm also joined by an amazing group of individuals. So we're just going to go around the table and let them all introduce themselves. So first, we're going to have Denise, who's civil rights attorney and faculty director at the Voter Access and Engagement Initiative at Washington University. Denise, thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you so much for having me. I'm so excited to be here and particularly excited about the topic of this panel, racial solidarity as a verb, because that implies that the work we have to do is action oriented. Verbs are action oriented, and there's actions we can all take to advance equality and to dismantle systemic barriers to full participation in our society. So I'm super excited to be here. My name's Denise Lieberman. I am a civil rights attorney, and I specialize in racial justice and voting rights and election law and constitutional law. And I serve as the director of the Missouri Voter Protection Coalition, and also work at Washington University in St. Louis as the faculty director of the Voter Access and Engagement Initiative. And I also teach in the Department of Political Science in the School of Law. And so I'm coming to you today as an attorney, but as an attorney that has dedicated my career to dismantling systemic barriers to full participation. And I come to this work from my own lived experience, growing up in a multiracial family. My siblings and my in-laws are all people of color, and all of my nieces and nephews are multiracial. And I grew up in a community that was blockbusted. I was born in the late 60s, grew up in the 70s, and my community was blockbusted. And my parents were the only original family in our neighborhood not to move out. And instead they ran for public office, and both of them held public office. I grew up in a neighborhood that, aside from myself, because my siblings were African-American, as the only white child in my neighborhood and the only white child in my grade school. And even within my own family, our family celebrations were steeped in cultural traditions of varieties of communities of color. And so for me, I grew up being able to see different cultures uplifted. And so it was really a shock for me, actually, when I got to college, to see that, in fact, the world did not work that way. And I think that's probably what originally inspired my desire to continue to work in civil rights. And as an attorney, one of the things that I do is work to dismantle systemic barriers to full participation. And in the voting rights arena, this is so critical. You know, your vote is your voice. And it is literally the vehicle that society has that tells you count, quite literally, right? And so when the right to vote is denied or abridged, what does that tell you? It tells you you don't count and you don't matter. And so for me, using voting rights as the vehicle to unpack this stuff feels very important, because voting is not just about politics, about whether you like Democrats or Republicans. It's also the way that we exercise self-determination over our own lives. And ultimately, for me, that is the true definition of being free. If you do not have the ability to control your own destiny, to even have a say in the matters that affect you on a day-to-day basis, you are not free. And what we know is, of course, the voting is even bigger than that. It's not just the way that we speak as individuals, but it is also the way that we build power collectively to dismantle barriers to full participation, to equality. And so it is a critical structure that that helps allow us to build power. And as a civil rights lawyer, it can be really challenging to identify and dismantle systemic barriers. It's when you are trying to dismantle barriers in the law, sometimes they can be overt, like maybe the days of literacy tests and poll taxes. But the kinds of barriers we see today are no less insidious and are no less systemically racist. They just don't look like it on their face. And so to unpack that, you have to go deeper. You have to pull back the curtain, and you have to not just understand the lived experiences of communities who are differently affected than you are. In particular, when it comes to voting, we have never been a country that has allowed full and free access to the franchise. And we have historically limited the franchise based on race. Back historically, before the Civil War, after the Civil War, in the post-Reconstruction era, during the Civil Rights Movement, and of course, even here today. And I have had the privilege and honor of being able to be a lead attorney in Georgia over the last few months, tackling some of the voting laws that are taking place there, right? And so what you see are laws that on their face maybe don't look racist at all, right? They're things that are going to limit the time where people can vote early, perhaps limiting the opportunity to cast ballots on Sundays, right? And until you understand the lived experiences of people in Georgia, particularly communities of color, who historically have organized massive get out the vote campaigns on Sundays as part of Souls to the Polls programs, you don't really fully appreciate that a measure like that is indeed racist, right? And so without going into further detail on this now, because I know my intro here is limited, I have a few themes that drive me in the work that I do. We subscribe to a concept called community lawyering. And what that means is that you have to not only listen to impacted communities, but you actually have to stand behind impacted communities. I know as attorneys that can be sort of hard because we like to have the ones with the microphone. But the truth is, attorneys don't have all the answers. Politicians don't have all the answers. Organizers even don't have all the answers. Professors don't have all the answers. You know who has all the answers? People who live their lives every single day. Civil rights activist Ella Baker spoke about the genius of ordinary people. People are the greatest experts in their own lives. For those of us who want to dedicate our lives and our purpose to doing this work, it is our job not to tell them what the answer is or what the strategy is. It is our job to listen. It is our job to stand behind. It is our job to uplift the voices of people whose society, through systemic barriers, continues to create and silence in the process. And so our work is to hear people, but it's also to create space for people to speak their own truths, to lead their own organizations. It's not for us to come in and say, wait, we're going to do this work and lead somebody else's. We are here to build space in systems that have historically denied people of color space to be leaders, to hold their own destinies in their hands, and to bring the tools that we have to help open that space up and to help it get heard. And so I'm so excited to be here with such an esteemed panel and to be visiting with you all virtually. My niece and nephew both went to UC Boulder, and so I'm very sorry not to be able to be there with you in person, but I'm very excited for the dynamic conversation we're about to have.
Awesome. Thanks so much for joining. Can't wait to hear some more. So next we got up is John, audio program director and podcast host of Center for Documentary Studies at Duke University. John, thanks so much for joining us. I'm going to hand it over to you.
Thank you, Adriana. It's really good to be here with all of you. I'm coming to you all from Durham, North Carolina, as you might imagine, given that I'm at Duke University. So I appreciate so many of your comments, Denise, and I guess where I see my lane, I'm a journalist and a documentary maker. I worked in public radio for a long time. Now I produce this podcast, Scene on Radio. And by the way, I always have to spell that SCENE on radio. So when you go for, to your app to look for it, that's what to look for. But so I feel like my contribution is more sort of about why especially white folks should feel that we need to take action, right? And I guess and I think I'm here primarily because of a podcast series that I produced a few years ago along with my friend and collaborator Chenjerai Kumanyika, called Seeing White. And it was a 14-part series that told the story really of the construction of race, really from, it actually goes back to ancient times, but actually racism is a recent invention, 400, 500, 600 years, and really has been under construction practically up until the present, but certainly well into the 20th century. People were still in the process of making up this story of race and of how it works and what and ultimately the importance being, what does it mean for those of us who are deemed white in our culture in terms of our responsibility to do something about it. And I say, as I always say, I'm not talking about guilt or shame. I'm talking about responsibility. And I think we can probably say more about that as we have this conversation about what that means. But just to kind of summarize a few of the biggest takeaways from Seeing White, this podcast series we did. Number one, there are really two, and you can sort of boil down an 8-hour documentary series to these points. One is that race is not real. It's not biologically real. The God or the gods did not make people into 3 or 4 or 5 or 6 so-called races. Nature didn't create race. What nature did, and people living in different climates and so on, and different levels of sunlight, what that did over tens and tens of thousands of years is it gave us humanity that is, a whole bunch of different shades of brown, really, right? From kind of pinkish, light beige like me to people of the very darkest brown and everything in between. But the idea, so in that sense, obviously that's real, right? That human difference is real. But the idea that there are 3 or 4 or 5 or 6, nobody's ever agreed. There's never been any stability in how many races there are or where the lines are drawn, which should tip you off that it's just made up stuff. But anyway, this idea that there are, 4 or 5 or 6 races and that there's some real meaning to these distinctions. Historically, there's the whole point was actually that there was a hierarchy, but that is a recent invention, and it was really started by slave traders, European slave traders, who decided around the time that they decided that we're going to now start sailing to sub-Saharan Africa, and that's where we're going to kidnap people and haul them into slavery on our sugar plantations and tobacco plantations and so on. That it becomes very convenient to have a story about the innate inferiority and kind of less than full humanity of people that we're going to now call Black, and we're going to call ourselves white. That's what happened. And it happened, point number two, why? To justify the brutal exploitation of economic exploitation of a whole set of human beings for profit. So to understand race, you got to follow the money. That was true in the 1450s when people first started telling this story, and it's true today. Every bit as true today. The whiteness is doing the same job that it was invented to do 500 and some years ago. So I think I'm gonna stop there because I know we're gonna have plenty of time to get our little licks in on this conversation. But I guess the last thing I would just say is that I like to think of racism as a system of advantage. It was actually invented to advantage people who look like me. And another thing that we don't give enough attention to is how many goodies and handouts. We tend to have a lot of awareness about how Black people and then by extension, other people of color have been excluded, right? Barriers put up, exploitation of folks. But this society has also done lots of positive stuff for white people: land, money, GI Bill, loans under mortgage loans that people of color were excluded from. So a lot of our wealth has been built actually on handouts, but also based on taking and excluding and actually taking wealth out of Africa and basically on the backs of people of color. So I'm going to stop there, but I'm really looking forward to talking more with you all.
Awesome. Thank you so much, John. Man, there's just so much stuff to talk about there. Thank you. So next, we're going to introduce Michael, the Black Panther Party alumni and multicultural storyteller, who actually is going to share a little bit of a story for us to set the stage. So Michael, I'm going to hand it over to you.
All right. Greetings and salutations, you all. Again, my name is Michael D. McCarty. I'm a professional storyteller, a latter-day griot. I run my mouth for a living. So I don't know how many of you have ever met a professional storyteller, but let me just tell you a little bit about that real quick. 1992, I was at the CAGE conference. The CAGE is the Conference on Alternatives in Jewish Education. And how I got there is another story. I was at CAGE and I was introduced to a guy named Joel Ben Izzy. Joel Ben Izzy was introduced to me as a professional storyteller. I said, "You do what? People pay you to tell stories? How you do that?" I've been telling stories my whole life. So I picked his brain. Now, we as storytellers, we encourage people who want to be crazy enough to do what we do. So Joel was very helpful, gave me all kinds of information, answered my questions. And while talking to him, it came to me. I said, "I'm going to do this. And my motto is going to be, have mouth, we'll run it." And I've been running my mouth around the country and around the world ever since. Now, I was set up by my mom. My mom was my first storyteller. She's the one who encouraged me to read, and she is the one who told me and read me stories as long as I can remember, and I can remember till I was 2 years old. She also taught me that we have an obligation, a social obligation. We have an obligation. If we see something wrong in society, if we see somebody being done wrong, we either got to do something about it or call it to the attention of someone who can. And my mom instilled that in me. And I'm sure she loved instilling it in me until my senior year in high school, when I let her walk out and got kicked out a couple of months before graduation from St. Ignatius College Preparatory, where they spent a lot of money sending me. But I did what my mama had taught me to do. So, is it time for me to go into my story now? Can I go into my story now? All right. So I'm going to kick this all off with a story that I call The Power of Love. It was 1989. Me and some friends were traveling around the south of India, going to temples and ashrams and getting our spiritual groove on. So we went to the town of Pondicherry in the south of India to visit the Sri Aurobindo ashram. Now, we just sort of showed up. It was a 5-hour bus ride from wherever we were coming from. And we just showed up. We weren't worried about getting a room. According to the guidebook, it was a hot season in the south of India, and nobody in their right mind would be there but me and my friends. So my 2 friends went directly to the Park Guest House Hotel to get a room. I told them I'd meet them there a little later. I wanted to get the lay of the land a little bit. So I roamed the town a bit. And after an hour or 2, I headed to the Park Guest House. As I was walking up the steps to the lobby, I noticed this elderly Indian woman give me a real dirty look. And she said something to the young man sitting behind the desk. I walk up to this gentleman. He said, "Can I help you?" I said, "Yes, I'd like a room." "We don't have any rooms." Keys all over the board, up, down, and sideways. I asked about my 2 friends, who just happened to be white, if they had come, and yes, they had come, and they had been given rooms. Now, I'm picking up on something, duh, but I don't want to believe what I'm picking up on because I'm at an ashram, a spiritual place. But I maintain my spiritual equanimity. When will some rooms become available? Maybe in a day or 2. Okay, I'll go check into another hotel. The next morning, I'm having breakfast with my friends at the Park Guest House restaurant, only place in town with whole wheat toast. I'm a whole wheat toast kind of guy. And there's a guy I know who had checked into the hotel after I'd been by there the previous evening. Now, I maintain a positive attitude. Some rooms must have suddenly become available. So I go to the lobby. There's that woman, the one who'd given me the dirty look, checking some people in, an Indian family. And I'm standing to the side, waiting for her to take care of her business. And she looks at me and said, "What do you want?" With attitude. I said, "I came to see if you had some rooms available." "No, we don't have any rooms for you. This isn't just some hotel. This is for people who are coming for the Sri Aurobindo ashram. Like I'm halfway around the world and I don't know this." Now I am PO'd. I've had enough of this town. I have enough of this ashram. I'm out of here. So I make arrangements to leave the following evening. The next morning, I go to meet my friends for breakfast in the Park Guest House Hotel. I am physically barred from entering and told that I have to go get this person's permission to go in. Now, time out. You're talking about your former 60s militant type. I know how to yell, scream, cuss, and fuss. Ain't done it in a while, but I still remember how. But I maintain my spiritual cool. I go to the lobby. The woman sitting behind the desk, "Madam, I'm just going to have breakfast with my friends in a restaurant. I was just in there yesterday. May I go in?" "No, you wait in the lobby." "Oh, it's on now. I'm about to go Chicago West Side all over this place. I'm working myself up. I'm working myself up. I'm working myself up." And just as this voice in my head says, "This is a test. It's easy to love those that love you. The test is to love those that hate you." And I figure this woman qualifies. Now, you must understand, love was not uppermost in my mind in terms of things I wanted to send her. I can think of a hot, fiery place I'd happily have sent her and joyfully use my size 13s to help her get there. But I'm trying to maintain. Then I remember something I'd read about auras and the color pink. That pink was the color that represented divine love. And I figured we definitely needed divine love up in here. So mentally, I enveloped this woman in a bubble of pink light and I started pumping pink in her butt. I was pumping pink. I was pumping pink. I was pumping pink. I worked up a sweat pumping pink. This went on for a little while. All of a sudden, the woman comes over to me, totally different demeanor, totally different tone of voice. "Are your friends in the restaurant?" I'm from Chicago. We'd be suspicious. I'm like, "What's up? What's up? I'm getting set up. What's going on?" I said, "I don't know. You wouldn't let me go see." She said, "Well, go. Please go." And she personally escorted me into the restaurant. And as I walked into the restaurant and looked back at her, smiling sweetly, I realized I had experienced the power of love. Now, some years later, I would become a professional storyteller. And I would tell this story at community storytellers in Los Angeles. And after that particular meeting, when I told the story, several people came up and were very excited about the story. One friend in particular. A couple of months later, at this same meeting, this friend comes and tells me, Michael, let me tell you what happened. It seems that at her job, her boss thought it was her personal business to give my friend unholy hell each and every day. So this particular day, she decided she would send love. If not love, she would send like. If not like, she wouldn't send those, I want to choke you around your neck thoughts. You do the best you can. So she'd been doing this all morning at work. At lunchtime, all the employees were in this little lunchroom. My friend sitting here talking to someone there, the boss sitting next to her talking to someone over there. When the boss turned to her and started to engage her in pleasant, complimentary conversation. The power of love. Now, I'm gonna fess up. I have passed a test or two, but I have flunked quite a few. But it is worth the effort. And that's the end of that. The power of love.
Awesome. Thank you so much for that story. Got nothing but love for everybody on the panel right now and everybody else watching. So let's get into it. So what is solidarity as a verb? Why is it important? Why isn't it just enough to learn nowadays? Or, historically, why wasn't it ever enough? And why is it that it's just brought to light right now? So I'm gonna hand it over to everybody else, whoever wants to tackle this one first.
I'll take a minute on that. I guess for me, one thing that and I'm someone who there's a lot of white people who can tell the stories of having been raised in a very racist family or that kind of background. I don't have that story. I was raised, my parents were, self-described and really quote unquote progressives, and my dad was a high school teacher who had been educated by nuns. We lived in a very white place in Minnesota, but based on having kind of gotten a social justice education, my dad in particular raised us to, race got talked about in our house, and there was this clear set of lessons that racism is wrong, racists are bad people. Although, to be honest, it was all pretty abstract at that point. It was on the TV and the movies and the Sidney Poitier movies and the, Roots and stuff, because it was a very, very white place, as I've said. But I went on to be a journalist working in public radio, and that's right. I did a lot of reporting on race. I felt like I am learning. I'm fascinated by the persistence of racism. Why is it still a problem? But very clear ideas about it being, this does not strike me as a hard call morally, right? But I also sort of felt like I was okay. Like I was one of the innocent ones because I'm a non-racist, and I'm not telling dirty jokes. I'm not discriminating against anybody. I'm not doing any of the things that racists do. So I can kind of go about my life. And in fact, I was, what you might call an ally, in the sense that, going to the title of this session, right? In that I was rooting for Black people and Indigenous people and other folks of color to win the struggle for freedom and equal rights against those people over there, the racists, right? We're like a subset of the white community. And I was okay, like I was clean. But the things that I've learned, particularly in the last 4 or 5 years or so through the work that I've been doing on this podcast, I really see very clearly that that's not an adequate, it's not an adequate position or response. Because if you understand what systemic racism means, it means that all of our systems, all of our institutions were created in a racist white supremacist society. They are still shot through with structures that advantage someone who looks like me, disadvantage color, again and again, systematically. The kind of school that I'm likely to be able to go to if I'm white versus Black, right? On and on. How I'm seen by an employer, how I'm seen by a cop. And so that because I'm part of those institutions and those systems, I'm benefiting from them every day. And if I just go about my life swimming in that water, I'm complicit. So I need to be joining the struggle to transform and dismantle and rebuild those institutions in ways that are just and treat everybody equally. If I'm not, then I'm complicit, and effectively I'm racist.
Yeah. Yeah, this is so true. And I know, Denise, you do a lot of work that, ties perfectly into this. Can you talk a little bit about that as well?
Yeah, I mean, and it goes back to sort of how I started. I love the title of this panel, that racial solidarity is a verb, because verb implies that the action, that you have to do something, you have to act. And there's lots and lots of ways that we can act. Now, as an attorney, I tend to think in kind of tangible terms, like, does this law exist? Did we get it struck down? Are we changing this? Can you do this thing or can you not do this thing, right? But action is so much more than sort of what the laws on the books are, but it takes all of us engaging. I think that's really sort of the action that all of us have to do, is engage. And we can all engage in different ways, depending on sort of what our secret sauce is that we bring to the table, right? Mr. McCarty here, his secret sauce is that he's a storyteller, right? And Professor Buin, your secret sauce is that you are an incredible researcher. And, I'm a community organizer and an attorney, and I can go into court. So I start to look at how do we not just engage, but also dismantle. And your point is so well taken that everybody, all of us are impacted by systemic racism. So this is something that is not something that is just about people of color. This affects all of us, and it poisons all of us. It poisons our society, and it poisons everything we do. And so we have to actively fight against those structures. But I truly believe that and I hate sort of using like the kind of aggressive nature of fight, even though I am an attorney, because Michael, your comment about the power of love is really truly where it's at. I mean, it's not so much about fighting in an angry way. It's about fighting out of love, because we want all people to be able to exist in a space where they can control their own destinies. And a way we do that is by engaging and organizing together. Professor Buin, you'll may be happy to know that I got to spend quite a bit of time in North Carolina. I had the honor some years back of representing Reverend Barber when he was the head of the North Carolina State Conference of the NAACP in a legal challenge to a major voter suppression bill in North Carolina, House Bill 589, that they called the monster voter suppression bill. And, we brought a lot of what I'll call community lawyering tactics to this litigation. There were all sorts of ways that this law was racist, by enshrining photo ID requirements, by eliminating Sunday voting, which was key to the polls in North Carolina. But it was really about the community organizing that made this case so powerful. And I just want to share one short story. On the first day of trial, this was a trial that lasted more than a month, had more than 16 expert witnesses, literally millions of pages of evidence. And on that first day, one of our plaintiffs, lead plaintiffs, Rosanelle Eaton, took to the stand and told the story of her own life and her own family. And she was 94 at the time, and was the first African-American to register to vote in her county in North Carolina, and had to take a literacy test to do so. And so even just that part of the story alone sort of revealing that literacy tests weren't something relegated to the post-Civil War era, that they were still happening. They were still happening in the 20th century. They were still happening until the Voting Rights Act was passed in 1965. But then the repercussions and the backlash she got after subjecting herself to the inhumanity of having to to go to the county seat and recite the preamble of the Constitution from memory, while white men leered at her as an 18-year-old young woman. She was then subjected to violent backlash because she decided to go back and teach everybody else in her county how to pass that literacy test. And the Ku Klux Klan shot guns through her house. That day we were all getting ready and we're preparing for trial, and we had all these witnesses and we're getting ready to go and we're framing the legal arguments. And we were in Winston-Salem, North Carolina, which is kind of a smaller town. It's, you know, you got Charlotte, you got like the Triangle and Raleigh-Durham. We were in the middle of the state in sort of fairly tiny Winston-Salem, North Carolina. That's where the federal court was. And here we were focused on this trial and all the legal arguments about why this law was racist. We get out of trial that day and we come out the front door. There were 6,000 people there to protest. And Reverend Barber led them on a march to the park and talked about the power, the genius of ordinary people, of telling their stories. And the headline on the news that night wasn't lawyers go to court to challenge the law. There were enough of those headlines. The headline was the people rose up, the people stepped up, the people took to the streets to demand their right to vote. And Reverend Barber used to speak about the power of fusion politics, particularly in the post-Civil War era, during that first decade of Reconstruction, where newly freed African Americans who were first getting their right to vote organized along with progressive white folks to create a fusion political movement, and they got people elected in huge numbers. And I just need to share this data a little bit. In the decade after the Civil War, over 600 African Americans were elected to state legislative offices around the country. And there were 16 African Americans in the United States Congress. Now, all this was met by a tremendous and horrific backlash that was, as we all know, extremely violent, that ended up decimating a lot of that progress. But 16 African Americans in Congress in that decade after the Civil War. 100 years later, the year before the passage of the Voting Rights Act in 1964, there were just 3. And so it's the power both of organizing and collective organizing, as well as the power of restrictive laws to really decimate and silence people. Because what happened after that was the southern states, states around the country, but in particular the southern states, began passing new laws. 10 of the 11 southern states enacted amendments to their state constitutions to enshrine literacy tests and poll taxes and good character laws, which are the felon disenfranchisement laws we know about today. And it literally wiped out that the African American and low-income white voting blocks. And it took all the way through the civil rights movement and the passage of the Voting Rights Act to even start to reclaim some of that. The lesson I take from this is we can't let our guard down for a moment. We can't rest on our laurels. That this fight, that this work is daily work. It's daily affirmations that we have to undertake. It's daily acts of love. It's daily challenges to systems that aren't right. And it is incumbent upon people who are privileged in this system to realize that we're part of this system and to realize that we have unique responsibilities to call out systemic racism, to call out barriers, to call out our own privilege when we see it, as much as we also have an obligation to open up and create space for folks that are too often silenced in our communities of color to be able to speak and hold leadership and step back and let them lead. And I think it's a combination of both those things. And to me, both of those are quite active. They're both verbs in my view.
Yeah, and that, it's so true about, wanting to, just the empowerment and helping enrich communities and lifting everybody up. So I actually want to ask Michael, with all this great work you do with community organizing through, your storytelling that's so powerful, and being part of the Black Panthers, how have you, leveraged that to create this change to empower your local communities? And I think you're on mute, Michael.
Now you can hear me. Here we go. One of the amazing things that has happened, it's happened throughout history, but what's happened here recently, with all of these incidents of people of color in general, but Black people in particular, being shot, being killed, being beaten, being attacked for nothing, or trying to do stuff that people normally do. One of the things that I've seen happen is that I have been contacted by people, young people, white people, people from other countries, and they want to know. First, they want to know, people who have come from other countries, they want to understand the background of this madness. And John, thank you for that lesson. I'm going to be quoting you a lot. But then they want to know, what can we do? How can we help? What can we do to make things better? There's a phrase that's been around for as long as Black people have been around struggling. It's called the struggle continues. It's ongoing. You get a victory, you can't rest on your laurels, because that victory can be taken away from you. You have to keep going. You have to keep going. And the idea that people, they want to know. So often we look at something like racism or whatever society ills we're talking about. It's like Mount Everest. It's so humongous. What can I do? Well, you do the same thing you do if you're climbing Mount Everest. You take a step, and then you take another, and then you take another, and then you take another. And when you find people of like mind, all right, you work together. When you find people, and Denise, I think you brought it up, or maybe John, I can't remember. Hey, I'm old, I was gonna say. When you find people who are not of like mind, all right, listen. What is the possibility? Can there be a dialogue? Because if there's a dialogue, there's hope. Last year, there was this big white kind of racist rally going on somewhere in the South. And there was a group of Black Lives Matters folks who came as a counter protest. One of the organizers of the racist event said to that group of people, would you like to have a representative come up and talk about your opinion? And one of the persons from that group did so. Now, there were people who were catcalling and giving them grief and saying nonsense, but there were people who were listening. And afterwards, after that person got through and after then this event is over, I saw, it was amazing. These people started coming together and they started discussing. They started talking. Now, I'm gonna say something, then I'll let you get on to however you want to do it next, but I gotta say this. On YouTube, there is a documentary called American Revolution 2. Go see this documentary, American Revolution 2. Now, I'm gonna tell you my interpretation of something that happened in that. There is in the 60s and 70s in Chicago, the Illinois chapter of the Black Panther Party under the direction of Fred Hampton initiated the Rainbow Coalition. First in the Rainbow Coalition was the Young Lords. The Young Lords had been a Puerto Rican street gang which had become political. And then there were the Young Patriots, post-Southern whites, hillbillies. They wore black berets with little Confederate flags on them. Okay. Fred sent Bob Lee to the Young Patriots meeting, and they had a big Confederate flag on the wall, right? To the Young Patriots meeting to talk about what we had in common and why we should be working together. So you're paying you're paying money for substandard housing. So are we. Your supermarkets have dented cans and day-old vegetables and things. So do we. The police are kicking your butts and they kicking our butts. We should be working together. And at the end of the meeting, now what you're going to see is not what I'm about to say, but I'm a storyteller. I take artistic license. At the end of the meeting, the director of the film asked one of the senior young patriots, 80-something-year-old white guy, what do you think about what these Panthers said about you all working together? And according to me, he said, well, if them Black Panthers gonna support us, I guess we should support them Black Panthers. Now here is what you will not see in that movie. The following week, Bob Lee, our field secretary who was conducting this meeting, he was in the neighborhood by himself. Usually he had a bodyguard, but he was by himself. The cops saw him, swooped down, handcuffed, rough treatment, throwing him in the back of the car. There were young patriots who saw what was happening and they put the word out. The young patriots came, surrounded that police car and forced that cop to let Bob Lee go. Poor white folks and Black folks working together. Woo-hoo! All power to the people. Yeah.
And that actually, you know, gets me thinking about, you know, like the privilege we all have, right? So, you know, like the privilege that you have as being able to have a platform to, you know, as a storyteller, and John being able to have a podcast where you can explore these ideas, and Denise being able to be in chords to, you know, advocate and empower. So, you know, how can we all, you know, leverage our privilege? How can we, you know, overcome that fear? Because oftentimes it's not that we don't want to do something, it's that we're too scared. So, you know, I want to open it up to everybody. How can we leverage it? How can we overcome some of this?
Go ahead, John. Go ahead.
All right, I'm going to be quick. I think, you know, people and Denise alluded to, you know, people need to kind of find their spot, right? Their niche, the place that they can kind of connect up with what's going on. But one thing is that we're all part of a community. We're all part of a city or a town or a rural community or whatever. Many of us are part of a workplace, right? So those are places or a faith community, right? Those are places to start to begin to think or to ask or to inquire, you know, like who's one thing that I suggest is find out who's already doing the work. Because probably there's somebody who is doing the work in your community, whether it's trying to make the schools more better and more equal for everybody, trying to work on policing locally, what have you. And is there somebody that we can sort of come alongside and contribute to the work that they're doing? And then over time, you may find, you know, maybe eventually you're really active or you're even in a leadership role over time. But to begin with, by asking yourself who's already doing the work that I can support. That might mean in some cases writing checks for folks, right? That's just one thing of many that you know, people who can do that, and that can be very real. That can be a real contribution. So all those ways just to begin to think about it. And I'm going to let the rest of y'all take it from here with other ideas.
Yeah, I totally appreciate you saying that, and I agree. That's absolutely right. Like I sort of alluded in my last comment, you know, we all have our secret sauce, and perhaps that requires us to all sort of grow and we sort of figure out what it is. You know, perhaps we change the recipe over the years, but we all have our secret sauce, our thing that like really kind of makes us tick and drives us. And you know, I get this question a lot in the voting rights space. And yeah, I have a great story, you know, recent in 2020, you know, sort of that space really blew up and everybody wanted to do voting rights work, right? Everybody was like, we want to be the new Stacey Abrams, right? And you know, we saw lots of people coming in and like, I'm going to create a new organization. I'm going to like lead an organization. And it's like, you know what? Your state already has a Stacey Abrams. right? You know, you just maybe don't know her yet, or him yet, or them yet, right? And so I think that's a really good point. And I do, I've been doing in the civil rights space for quite a long time, and just have been in so many kind of white rooms where people are lamenting, like, why aren't there more Black people in our space? Why aren't there more Latinx people in our space? Why aren't there more people of color in our space? It's like, because you created a white space. The Black people are all down there doing the work. So, like, instead of asking why they ain't coming to you, why don't you go and you find ways to support them? And you don't support them by showing up and taking over the meeting. You support them by showing up and sitting in the back of the room and writing checks and then doing whatever it is your secret sauce is.
Yes.
You know, and so for me, it's
lick some envelopes, do some phone banking,
but
for starters.
All of us have something. You know, over this year in 2020, I had a bunch of theater and arts groups come and approach me. We had I live in Missouri. We brought some lawsuits challenging lack of access to mail-in voting here, and our laws require people to have notaries, and we know those disparately impact voters of color. And they were like, well, maybe we could sign up to be notaries and we can register people to vote. I'm like, you're artists, like, do some art. You know, like I can't draw a stick figure to save my life. I can write a legal brief, but I can't draw it, right? So and that's what they did. We had a group do a play. We had a group called Dance the Vote do a dance choreography about voting. It was amazing. And that's a way to do it. The other way, of course, is to show up, is to find out who's doing the work, and don't pretend like you're the savior for other people to come and do their work. You have to come in solidarity, and support because the work is already going on. You just might not know about it. And and it's not that hard to find, and it does require a willingness to be uncomfortable sometimes, especially for people who live in a place of privilege and a place where they're used to their skin tone being in the majority. It can be awkward and uncomfortable to go into spaces where that's not the case. And maybe you then have just a little bitty bit of the taste of what people of color experience every single day of their lives when they have to leave their homes, and why it is then can be such a precarious situation just to leave and go to the store, just to get to your car, just to go to school. I think that's part of how this happens. The other thing, and I learned this also from my time in North Carolina, because again, I'm a lawyer and I'm like, we have an agenda, we have to do this. Sitting down and breaking bread with people. When I first got involved in that North Carolina litigation, you know, I mean, we were in people's kitchen tables, we were on people's front porches, we were in church basements, and, you know, I'd be like, okay, we have an hour for this meeting, like we need to talk about that, and like an hour went by and we were just still drinking some iced tea, right? And I realized that that's what the meeting was actually about.
Yes.
That was actually what it was. It wasn't about to go over like these nuances of your testimony. People didn't need to go over their testimony. Mm-hmm. Again, they're the geniuses of their own life. They knew how to tell their own story.
And that tea was sweet too, wasn't it?
It was sweet tea. Yes. I'm not used to that in Missouri, but yes, it was sweet tea and it was good. And pie. Oh my goodness. Goodness gracious. I can't even tell you how much I gained weight when I was in North Carolina. But you know, I think setting aside those perceptions of what you expect things to be, and really letting other people lead the direction of the conversation, and being a reservoir, and being able to catch your own impressions, your own biases, your own things as they come up, really proved to be a valuable lesson for me.
Awesome. And I know we're close to time. It doesn't look like we have questions. So I want to open the floor up to everybody. You know, since we have these last few minutes, you know, some closing thoughts, you know, some words of wisdom to kind of wrap everything up, something that you really want to make sure that, you know, our viewers and each other, that we really get from this. I'll let anybody go.
All right, Michael.
All right, this is one of the things that you see when you listen to people is ignorance. Don't mean that maliciously. People just don't know. And the level of ignorance can be tremendous, as you'll see in this story. So it's around 1968. I'm in high school in Chicago. We had started our Black student organization, and there was a group of us, Black and white. We would go to other Catholic high schools in the Chicago area to talk about race. Again, this is the 60s, race is happening. So most of the questions were insightful and good, but then there was this one. This high school girl, as I recall, she was maybe a junior or a senior. She wasn't a little freshman, right? She raised her hand to ask a question, and this is the question she asked the panel. There were 4 of us on the panel, 4 Black, 1 white. And this she directed at the Black panelists. How do you sit with your tails in your pants? How do you sit with your tails in your pants? This is a supposedly intelligent Catholic high school girl. And that was one of the few times in my life that I have approached speechlessness. I got over it. But just think of the level of ignorance. And that meeting that I was talking about, where there were these people, there was the Black Lives Matters at this meeting. There was this one woman who just was a font of ignorance. She didn't even have to open her mouth. It was coming out of ears. Now, sometimes you can do something about that just by helping to point them in the right direction. But the bottom line is this to me: you do what you can where you at. Whatever that, no matter how small that thing is, give somebody. I give away books. I give books to kids. I give books to adults. I have these little pop open cards I give to people and make them smile and laugh. Whatever you can do it.
Wow. Really powerful words. Thank you so much, Michael. John or Denise, do y'all have anything else? Some last little bits of advice before we wrap things up?
I'll say something really brief. I guess, we've talked a lot about the actions that we take in our communities, and I think there's nothing more important than that. I personally, this is something we talk about in the Seeing White podcast series, and is I think there are big societal things that need to happen. We talked about institutions and systems, but I also think we have a huge moral and frankly financial debt that is owed in this country, particularly to the descendants of enslaved Black people in this country. I think we can have conversations about reparations for other folks, certainly Indigenous Americans, but that we should be having those conversations. And so that, for me, another form of action is politics. I do think it matters a whole lot how we vote. And I don't think that's ever been more clear than it has in the last few years. Not to get partisan, but come on. There's some folks that want to undo the 20th century. And there's some folks who are trying to, push us ahead. And so at the local level, at the state level, at the federal level, who is in Congress matters a whole lot. I also think we did a whole podcast series. Our most recent series is about democracy in America. It's called The Land That Never Has Been Yet. And it's a Langston Hughes line. And it talks about how we have never been all that democratic in this country. So yes, I just want to put that on the table, that there's a lot of work to do at the level of politics and that kind of action as well.
Yeah, very true. Got to make your voice heard.
I will second that.
Amen.
But voting is not just about it's important who we elect because they represent, ideas and things, but it's about more than that. As I started my remarks off today, it truly is about a societal statement about who matters and who counts, but it's also about how we build power, and building power, particularly for oppressed people, communities that have been historically oppressed, is how change happens. And we know that that doesn't come by accident. Power concedes nothing without a demand. And so it is incumbent upon all of us to create spaces for communities who have been historically oppressed, particularly communities of color, to be able to speak in a public sense and to build power. And that is how, and we all have something to contribute to that. And that is how we get closer to the beloved community, or the society that we all want and dream of for ourselves and for our own families, and that all people are deserving to have.
Yes.
Yeah.
Right on.
Thank you so much for those
Right
powerful
on.
Denise, and thank you so much, Michael and John, as well, for joining us. So thank you, everybody, for joining us today. Special thanks, of course, to our speakers who volunteered their time. If you want to support them or learn more about their work, you can find their books, their podcasts, and social media accounts linked on the CWA website. If you want to stay engaged with this topic, you can join CWA Racism in the U.S. Committee in participating in the Dr. Eddie Moore Jr.'s 21-day Racial Equity Challenge. You can sign up for more information. The link is in the YouTube chat. And finally, CWA relies on generosity from people like you to make this event possible. So please consider making a gift to CWA, which can also be done on the CWA website at www.colorado.edu/CWA. Tune in through Sunday, April 11th for live CWA events, or catch up on any of those you may have missed. And thank you again, everybody, for joining us.
Woohoo!
Thank you all.
Yay!
Great to talk with you.
All power. Love that artichoke.
Onward. Oh.
Thank you.
All right, y'all. Well, that was a pleasure, Michael. So good to get a chance to meet you a little bit. Oh, you're muted, I think.
Be muted? No. There you go. Yay!
I don't know if people out there